Over my years of teaching math, many students have expressed their hatred of fractions. Fractions just make things so much more difficult, said one student. 20 years ago, many math classes focused on adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing fractions. Today, however, with the thought that almost everyone has a calculator capable of doing fractions on their phone or on their wrist, the focus has switched to solving real-life word problems with fractions. The major focus of this module will also be on solving real-life word problems involving fractions. Starting with this module, and for the rest of the modules afterwards, you may use a calculator when solving the problems, and also for the assessments. I would advise you to have a calculator that is not too difficult to use. Some have so many buttons on them that they actually create a hindrance to the user. If you are interested in what I consider to be a good calculator for the rest of this course, you can certainly check with me. With all that being said, using a calculator for everything with fractions doesn't make any sense. There are certainly some aspects of fractions that you should be able to do quickly in your head without the use of a calculator. So, in this first video on fractions, I am going to discuss the basics of fractions, which are important tools to have when solving fractional word problems. I encourage you to solve the problems we are going to talk about first without a calculator, and then with a calculator, just to make sure you know how your particular calculator works with fractions. As far as the assessment goes on this module, however, you can certainly use your calculator when solving the problems. So, what are fractions? Fractions are also known as rational numbers, and the actual definition is it is the set of all numbers, a over b, where a and b are integers, but b cannot equal 0. There are two different parts for every fraction. The top number is known as the numerator, and the bottom number is known as the denominator. Now the denominator is the number of equal parts a whole is divided into, while the numerator is the number of parts that you are talking about in that particular fraction. So, why can't the denominator equal 0? Well, there are really all sorts of mathematical reasons, but maybe the simplest is because you can't have something divided into 0 pieces. So, if you see a fraction that does have a value of 0 for the denominator, let's say something like 5 divided by 0, mathematicians don't say that that answer is 0. Instead, we would say that it's not possible, as one possible answer, or another possible answer that you might see is that it is undefined. Now remember, this is any time that the value of the denominator is equal to 0. One of the terms I'm sure you've heard of in the past is equivalent fractions. Equivalent fractions are exactly as they sound, fractions that are equal to one another. If I have the fraction 1/2, I can certainly draw a picture of what 1/2 looks like. And 1/2 might look something like this. I take that, I divide up into 2 equal pieces, and I shade in one of them. Well, I could also take the same size, I'm going to try and draw the same size square here as much as I can, and I could divide it up into 4 equal pieces and shade in 2 of them, and you can see that I have the same amount of each one of those 2 squares shaded in. I could do the same thing with 3/6. Once again, I'm trying to draw a square that's about the same size, and if I divided this up into 6 equal pieces, as best as I can, I could shade in 3 of them, and once again I have the same amount of each one of these squares shaded in. So we would say that each one of these fractions, 1/2, 2/4, and 3/6, they are equivalent fractions. Now, as far as this goes, there is another term that you've probably heard before, which is the lowest term fraction. Of these 3 fractions, the fraction that is in lowest terms is the 1/2. And the reason it's in lowest terms is because that particular way of writing that fraction is really the easiest way to think about it. It's certainly easiest to divide that square up into two sections and just shade in one of them than it is to do it the other two ways. So that fraction is known as the lowest term fraction. Later on, we'll talk a little bit more mathematically about what makes that fraction the lowest term fraction. One of the things that you will need to do when working with fractional word problems is to be able to either recognize some fractions that are equal to each other or to find an equivalent fraction for a given fraction. So here I have the fraction 3/8. What would be an equivalent fraction for 3/8? Well, there are an infinite number, but one way that you can go through and find an equivalent fraction is you can always multiply this particular fraction 3/8 by something that's equal to 1. So I'm just going to pick something that's equal to 1, and I could decide to multiply this by 4 over 4. Now, 4 over 4 is equal to 1. And anytime you multiply something by 1, you get exactly the same thing. And if I go through and multiply, I'm just going to multiply the numerators and then multiply the denominators, I get another fraction of 12/32. So I know that 12/32 and 3/8 are exactly the same fraction. I could certainly do that with another 3/8. If I wanted to, I could multiply this by 10 over 10. Because once again, 10 over 10 is equal to 1. In doing that, I get 30/80ths. So, one way of going through and finding an equivalent fraction is to multiply that fraction by another fraction that's equal to 1. And of course, fractions that are equal to 1 just have to have the same numerator and denominator. So all these fractions that I'm writing right now are fractions that are all equal to 1. So anytime that you are given any fraction, you can always find an equivalent fraction by just multiplying that by something that's equal to 1. In the same way that you can multiply any fraction by 1 to get an equivalent fraction, you can also divide a fraction by 1 in order to get an equivalent fraction. So, if I have 12/20ths, I could choose to divide this by 2 over 2. Once again, 2 over 2 is equal to 1, so I'm dividing by 1, and anything divided by 1 is exactly the same thing. If I do that, I get an answer here of 6/10. Or, if I wanted to, I could take 12/20ths, and I could choose to divide this by 4 over 4. If I did it this time, I get 3/5 for an answer. So 3/5 is also equivalent to 12/20ths. Notice, though, that if I have 12/20ths, I cannot easily divide this by 6 over 6. I can divide 12 divided by 6 and get 2, but 20 divided by 6, although there is an answer to it, it's not a whole number answer, and because of that, it makes things a little bit more difficult. So, as I'm going through and using this division rule of 1, as this is called, I call this the division rule of 1 because I'm dividing by 1. If I am using the division rule of 1, I need to pick a fraction equal to 1 that I can use so that I can divide both the numerator and denominator by that particular number. Earlier, we had talked about lowest term fractions, and I'd like to give you a little bit better definition of what a lowest term fraction is. So I have 4 different fractions here: 13/26, 6/8, 27/39, and 14/15. Out of all of those fractions, which ones, or one possibly, is in lowest terms? As I take a look at these, I am trying to think about something that I can divide both of these, or both the numerator and denominator, by. So if I have 13/26, is there a number that I can divide both 13 and 26 by? Well, there is. I could divide by 13 over 13. And if I do that, I get 1/2 for an answer. For 6/8, is there a number I can divide both 6 and 8 by? There is. I can divide by 2 over 2, and I get 3/4. How about 27/39? With 27/39, I can divide by 3 over 3. And if I do that, I get 9/13 for an answer. How about 14/15? Is there something that I can divide both 14 and 15 by at the same time? Well, there isn't. The only factors of 14 are 1 times 14 and 2 times 7. And the only factors of 15 are 1 times 15 and 3 times 5. So, in this particular case, there's only the number 1 that's a common factor for both 14 and 15. So the only thing that I could divide this by would be 1 over 1, and I'd still get that 14/15, which leads us into the definition of determining whether or not a fraction is in lowest terms. If you can only divide the top and the bottom, the numerator and denominator, by 1, then we say that fraction is in lowest terms. So here I have two different fractions, 45/60ths and 12/55ths. One of them is in lowest terms, one of them is not. I'd like you to pause this, put the one that is not in lowest terms, and then start this back up again and check and see. Okay, hopefully you had time to go through and do this. As I take a look at this, the very first one, 45/60ths, 45/60ths is not in lowest terms. I could, if I wanted to, certainly divide this by 5 over 5. In doing that, I get 9/12. Now the question is 9/12 in lowest terms? Well, 9/12 is also not in lowest terms because I can divide this now by 3 over 3. And if I divide it by 3 over 3, I get 3/4. So, is 3/4 in lowest terms? Yes, it is, because the only thing I can divide both 3 and 4 by is 1. So that is in lowest terms. So it took me 2 steps. Now, it wouldn't have had to have taken me 2 steps if I had, right from the get-go, divided 45/60ths divided by 15/15ths. Then I would have immediately gotten 3/4 for an answer. So it doesn't matter how many steps it takes, you just need to make sure you can get it down into lowest terms. The second problem I have here, 12/55ths, is in lowest terms. There's nothing that I can divide both 12 and 55 by other than 1 over 1. So that one already was in lowest terms. Now I mentioned to you earlier that using a calculator is certainly something that you do need to be able to know how to do with this. And your calculator that you have should be able to tell you, just by punching in the fraction, if it is in lowest terms or if it is not in lowest terms. If it's not in lowest terms, your calculator will put it into lowest terms for you. So that is one thing that you do want to check and make sure of with your calculator, that you understand how to do that. And once again, if your calculator is not doing that, or if you want a recommendation for which calculator to get that would be easy to work to do that, just let me know. In all the fractions that I have given you so far, the numerator has always been smaller than the denominator. But that certainly does not need to be true all the time. For instance, how about if you were given the fraction 5/3? In this particular case, the numerator is 5 and the denominator is 3. But what does 5/3 mean? Can you draw a picture of what 5/3 means? Once again, could you pause this video, draw a picture, if you can, of what 5/3 looks like, and then start it back up again. Okay, hopefully you have been able to go through and draw a picture. I am going to draw a picture that may work for 5/3. 5/3 means that not only do I have something that is 3/3, for instance, this picture right here, I have another whole divided up into thirds, and I have another 2/3. So this particular picture shows 5/3. It's not sixths. I realize there are 6 different pieces there, but each one of the wholes is divided up into thirds. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about the denominator being divided up into thirds. So this is a picture showing 5/3. Well, there certainly is another way that we could write this as well. We could say that it is the same thing as 1 and 2/3, because I have one whole circle shaded in and 2/3 of another circle. There are names given for each one of these types of numbers. 5/3 is known as an improper fraction. I've never really liked that term because it makes it sound as if the fraction did something wrong when it really didn't. But any time at all that you have a numerator larger than the denominator, we call that an improper fraction. 1 and 2/3 is also given a name, and it is called a mixed number. And it's called a mixed number because it has a whole number, in this case 1, and also a fraction put together. So we call 1 and 2/3 a mixed number. Being able to change numbers from improper fraction to mixed numbers, or from mixed numbers to improper fractions, is once again something that your calculator will do for you. But once again, it is somewhat important that for the easy ones, you can just do that in your head. So if I gave you the the improper fraction 8/5, and if I wanted to change that into a mixed number, one way that people do that is they just say to themselves, well, how about if I divide 5 into 8? 5 goes into 8 one time. 5 times 1 is 5. I'm left over with 3. So this is 1 and 3 out of 5 pieces left over. So 1 and 3/5 is exactly the same thing as 8/5. If I was given the mixed number 1 and 3/5 and I wanted to change it to an improper fraction, perhaps you remember that one way to go about doing that is to multiply the 5 times the 1 and get 5, add the 3 to get your 8, and keep the same denominator. I get 8/5. Another reason this works, if I have 1 and 3/5, is because the 1 is exactly the same thing as 5/5. And I chose 5/5 just so I kept the same denominator. And then 5/5 plus the 3/5 gives me 8/5. As I said, you can certainly go through and use your calculator to do this. I do think it's important that for the easy ones, you can do them quickly in your head, and sometimes that will make solving the word problems a little bit easier. If you would like additional practice on just changing from improper fractions to mixed numbers without the use of a calculator, there are certainly all sorts of things on websites that you can be using to help go through that particular skill. Before going on to the second video in this module, I would like you to complete a quick check on this video, which can be found next. In it, you will find 5 quick problems that can be used to check your understanding. As you are doing them, please try to do them first without a calculator and then with a calculator. If you do well in the quick check, you are ready to watch the next video. If you have difficulty with it, you may want to review this video again, or look at some websites that I have in the module to help with your understanding. As always, you can certainly contact me as well if you would like. Thank you.